In just a few minutes, a fast Russian assault force was wiped out in open ground before it could even reach the Ukrainian trench line. Around 17 Russian troops on motorcycles raced across no man's land, trying to cross the danger zone before Ukrainian drones could lock on. Instead, the entire attack collapsed in fire, smoke, and confusion almost as quickly as it began. What makes this clash so disturbing is not only the speed of the destruction, it is the fact that the attack was already in trouble long before the first explosion. On this battlefield, danger no longer waits only in mines, artillery, or hidden infantry positions. It now follows movement from above, tracks heat, watches routes, and strikes at the moment a unit becomes most exposed. That is why this was a clear example of how Ukraine is turning drones into a layered hunting system. A strike group can now be seen from far away, followed while it accelerates, split apart under pressure, and destroyed just before it reaches the point of impact. The deeper story is not simply that motorcycles failed where armored vehicles have also struggled. The deeper story is why a tactic built on speed, surprise, and narrow timing can now fall apart so completely. And that leads to the bigger question. If speed is no longer enough to survive the crossing, what option is left for Russian forces trying to get close to Ukrainian trenches at all? This assault did not begin as a reckless burst of speed, but as a calculated attempt to solve a battlefield problem that has become harder for Russian forces with every passing month. Heavy armored vehicles can still bring men forward, but they also draw fire, attract drones, and struggle across broken ground that has already been torn apart by shells, craters, and failed attacks. That is why this push began with motorcycles instead. They were not chosen because they were strong, but because they were fast, narrow, and harder to hit in the first few moments of movement. Around 17 Russian troops were sent forward on bikes in a compact assault group, and their mission was brutally simple. They had to cross the strip of open land between two defensive lines before Ukraine could organize a proper response. They were not riding out to fight a long battle in the open. They were trying to reach the trench line, jump off the motorcycles, rush the position, and create enough shock at the front to give the next wave a better chance to move in behind them. In that kind of attack, every second matters because the unit survives only as long as its speed stays ahead of the enemy's targeting cycle. The route ran across damaged earth, through tracks already scarred by artillery and earlier traffic, with loose dirt, shell holes, and uneven patches waiting to throw off any rider who lost focus for even a moment. A heavy troop carrier would have crossed that space more slowly and with far more noise. A motorcycle could slip through faster, cut across rough lanes, and reduce the time spent in the most dangerous zone. The formation reflected that logic from the start. The riders did not bunch together in one tight mass, because that would have made them easier to destroy in one strike. Instead, they stretched themselves along the direction of advance, leaving enough space between bikes to reduce the chance that one explosion would tear through the whole group at once. The attack depended on that spacing, because distance between riders was one of the few forms of protection they had left. Yet the weakness of the plan was visible from the same moment. A motorcycle can carry a soldier quickly, but it cannot shield him from blast, fragments, or a drone diving out of the sky. It cannot absorb punishment the way heavier armor can, and it gives the rider very little room to recover once panic enters the formation. The group had to remain fast, controlled, and unseen long enough to touch the trench before the battlefield around it could react. So the men kept riding. Engines pushed harder as they entered the exposed ground, and the attack began to look exactly as it was designed to look: sudden, narrow, and difficult to stop in the first seconds. But that impression was misleading. The real danger was not waiting at the trench line ahead. It was already forming at a distance. The most important moment in this assault was not when the riders would meet Ukrainian infantry. It was the instant they became visible in ground that only seemed empty. The attack changed the moment Ukraine saw it, because speed only works until someone begins tracking the movement in real time. As the Russian riders pushed harder across the open ground, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones were already watching the approach routes from a distance. What appeared below was not a large armored column or a slow convoy that needed time to identify. On the screens, the assault showed up as a line of fast-moving heat marks cutting across cold terrain just before dawn. That image alone was enough to tell Ukrainian operators that this was not routine movement. It was a strike force trying to reach the trench line before a defense could fully tighten. That was the moment the entire logic of the clash shifted. Up to that point, the Russian plan still depended on surprise, even if only for a short window. Once the riders were spotted, that window began to close almost immediately. The open strip ahead was no longer just ground to be crossed. It became a watched corridor, and every meter the motorcycles covered now brought them deeper into a space where their direction, spacing, and pace could be followed from above. Ukraine did not wait for the group to get close enough for infantry at the trench to deal with it. A team of FPV drones was sent out from behind the line to meet the riders before they could reach the last and most dangerous stage of the approach. The Russian troops were still focused forward, still trying to beat the clock, but another force was already moving toward them from a different layer of the battlefield. One side was racing toward a position. The other was racing to cut that move apart before it arrived. As the motorcycles kept pushing on, the ground itself began to interfere with the attack. One rider in the rear section hit the broken edge of an old shell crater at speed, and the bike jolted hard enough to force a sharp correction. That brief loss of rhythm did not stop the assault, but it disturbed the pattern that had held the group together. A few riders adjusted around the wobble, some narrowed their spacing, and others drifted slightly off the line before pulling back into the advance. The disruption lasted only seconds, yet in an attack built on timing and shape, seconds were enough to matter. From above, that short disturbance made the group easier to read. A formation that begins stretched and controlled can still present a problem to an incoming strike, because each rider is moving with some order. That is when the difference between a fast assault and a vulnerable one starts to show. Ukraine no longer had to deal with a clean arrow moving toward the trench. It was now watching a target that had already begun to lose its perfect flow. From that point on, the clash stopped being a simple ground raid and became a layered pursuit. The Russian unit still had to keep moving, because slowing down would only make the danger worse. The next phase of the clash began when the Ukrainian FPV teams finally saw that one motorcycle in the Russian group was not like the others. As the drones closed in and the image on the screens became clearer, one bike showed extra equipment fixed behind the rider. It was carrying an electronic warfare jammer, and that changed the meaning of the entire chase in an instant. That machine mattered because it could interfere with the final seconds of a drone attack, which are often the most important seconds of all. A jammer can connect to the electronic warfare base near there, break the video link, distort the signal, or delay control long enough to throw the strike off target. On open ground, where there is almost no real cover, even a thin electronic shield can mean the difference between a direct hit and a miss. That is why the motorcycle carrying the jammer immediately became the most important target in the whole formation. From that point on, the Ukrainian drones were no longer simply chasing a moving column. They began working with a clearer purpose. Some stayed close enough to keep the group under pressure and maintained visual contact. Others adjusted their angles and speed so they could be in position once the order came to strike the jammer first. The Russian riders were still driving hard toward the trench line, but the center of gravity of the battle had already shifted. It was no longer just about stopping the assault. It was about removing the one piece of equipment that could still give that assault a path through the danger. At the same time, another layer of the battlefield was beginning to wake up behind the Russian formation. As the incoming drones moved beyond the folds of the terrain and became easier to notice, the Russian air defense network started entering the fight. A radar station positioned not far from the assault route was switched on and began sweeping the sky behind the moving column. Its operators were not seeing a full picture yet, but they could already tell that multiple fast targets were pushing into the area from low altitude. Until then, the FPV drones had stayed low, approached from uneven angles, and used the ground itself to reduce the chance of early detection. That made the approach dangerous but manageable for the Ukrainian side. Once they climbed or crossed into clearer viewing space, the risk changed sharply. The signs appeared first on the Ukrainian operators' screens. The image that had been tense but readable started to flicker. Static lines cut across the picture. Shapes blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. The motorcycles remained visible, but not in a stable way. The video feed began to pulse with interference as Russian electronic warfare pushed back against the drones, now entering the final approach. That pressure fell directly on the Ukrainian crews controlling the drones. They now had to keep their focus while the image broke apart in front of them. So the engagement entered its most fragile stage. Russia still had a moving assault force, and its electronic warfare was starting to interfere at exactly the right time. Ukraine still had drones in striking range, but the window for a clean attack was closing fast. The next moments would decide whether the jammer remained alive long enough to shield the column, or whether the Ukrainian teams would take the risk and dive before the screen went dark. By this stage, the Russian electronic warfare screen was doing exactly what it had been meant to do, and the Ukrainian FPV teams were now fighting the signal as much as they were fighting the assault itself. The picture on several screens kept breaking apart into blur, static, and sudden jumps in position. Shapes that were clear 1 second became smeared shadows the next. The motorcycles were still there, still moving, but the approach had turned into a race against blindness. If the interference held for only a little longer, some of the drones would lose the final guidance they needed, and the entire interception could collapse at the last moment. That was why the Ukrainian operators made the most dangerous choice available to them. A few drones had already closed the distance enough to attempt a strike, and waiting for a cleaner picture was no longer realistic. The crews understood that if they delayed, the jammer bike might survive, the rest of the formation might break through, and the signal might disappear completely. So instead of backing off, they took the risk and committed early. The order was not to spread the attack across the whole group. The order was to hit the motorcycle carrying the jammer before the screen went dark. The dive happened fast. One FPV dropped out of the noisy sky, corrected once through a field of flickering interference, and then drove straight toward the bike that had been identified as the key to the Russian defense. The rider was still moving with the rest of the group, still trying to keep pace with the push toward the trench line, when the drone came in low and hard. A single flash followed, then a sharp burst of fire and fragments. The jammer bike was torn apart in an instant, and the machine that had been disrupting the final approach was suddenly gone from the battlefield. That strike changed the air picture almost immediately. The pressure on the remaining drones began to ease, as the most important source of interference inside the moving formation had been removed. The screens did not become perfectly clear, yet the image stabilized enough for the operators to recover control with more confidence. They could now hold targets more cleanly, correct their approach later, and push the surviving drones deeper into the attack without guessing every second of the flight. The Russian group had lost the one moving shield that had given it a chance to survive the crossing. The Russian riders understood that something had gone badly wrong. The blast in the middle of the group broke what was left of the assault rhythm, and several men abandoned the original plan almost at once. Some left their motorcycles where they stopped and ran toward a nearby tree line, hoping the woods would give them cover from the drones. Others kept riding, trying to outrun the danger before another drone dropped in. A few machines were left upright or half fallen in the dirt, engines still running beside the track as their riders fled on foot. The Ukrainian drones split their attention quickly. One chased men who were running for the forest edge and struck just before they reached the first real cover. Another followed a motorcycle still moving alone and hit it on the route of retreat, turning the bike into a burning wreck on open ground. A third stayed on the abandoned vehicles, using them as fixed targets after the riders had scattered. In only a short span, the assault had stopped looking like a coordinated push and started looking like a broken force trying to survive in fragments. The battle did not end when the jammer bike exploded, because the destruction of that one vehicle created a second emergency for the Russian side almost at once. The radar and electronic warfare position behind the assault route could now see that the motorcycle push had lost its protective core and was falling apart in open ground. Signals went out from the rear, and requests for support were passed to forces deeper behind the line, including the troops positioned near the trench area that had been meant to receive the assault. That response brought in a new threat. A small relief group of tanks and armored personnel carriers was ordered forward to reach the damaged assault lane, recover whatever troops were still alive, and stop the collapse from turning into a total battlefield loss. If those heavier vehicles could reach the area in time, they might pull survivors out of the kill zone, add firepower to the fight, and still create pressure on the Ukrainian trench line. But the rescue move did not remain hidden for long. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, already watching the wider area, picked up the movement behind the Russian line and identified fresh vehicles coming forward. The warning reached the drone teams quickly. The problem was no longer limited to the men scattered across the open ground and the edge of the forest. Another force was now on the move, and it could change the situation if it arrived before Ukraine acted again. Meanwhile, the Russian soldiers who had escaped the motorcycles were trying to survive on foot. Some reached the first trees and turned to fire upward through the branches, hoping rifle fire might keep the drones back long enough to regroup. That effort did not work. One drone followed two men as they ran between the trunks, then struck just after one of them stopped to aim into the sky. Another tracked a soldier who threw himself behind a tree and then tried to sprint to a second position. He was hit before he could get there. The woods offered concealment but not safety, and the men who had abandoned their bikes now found that the drones were following them into the cover they had hoped would save them. The larger danger, however, was the relief column still pushing forward. Ukraine understood that if the tanks and armored vehicles reached the broken assault zone, they could possibly continue the mission toward the trench line. That was enough to trigger an immediate request for more drone launches. Fresh FPV teams were brought into the fight, and reconnaissance units kept the rescue convoy under continuous watch as it moved closer. The interception began before the relief force could fully deploy. One armored vehicle moving in front was hit near the route into the damaged area and stopped at an angle, blocking part of the lane behind it. A second strike hit another vehicle trying to move around the first, forcing the crew to halt before they entered the most dangerous stretch. Then a drone drove down onto a tank that had continued forward despite the first explosions, hitting it close enough to stop the advance and throw the rest of the group into hesitation. That hesitation became the final break in the rescue attempt. Some Russian vehicles remained in place while others began turning around rather than continuing into the drone-covered zone. The column had not been fully destroyed, but it had been stopped, split, and pushed back before it could save the men ahead. By the end of this phase, the failed motorcycle assault had become something even more serious for Russia. What stands out most in this battle is not one explosion or one failed rush. It is the way the entire assault was broken apart layer by layer before it ever reached the Ukrainian trench line. The Russian side traded armor for speed and sent troops forward on motorcycles, hoping that a fast push across open ground would succeed where heavier vehicles have struggled. Ukraine answered with something very different. It used detection, tracking, pressure from above, and a final strike sequence that turned movement itself into a trap. That is the deeper message of this clash. Almost any exposed movement can be seen, followed, and attacked within minutes. It shows how modern war is changing at the lowest tactical level. The larger question now is what comes next. If motorcycles are fast but too exposed, and armored vehicles are stronger but easier to detect, then what kind of assault can still cross open ground under constant drone pressure? More electronic warfare may appear. More deception may follow. Smaller units may try new routes and new timing. In the next round of fighting, will speed remain an advantage? Or is it starting to make assault groups easier to see and easier to destroy? Share thoughts in the comments. And if this breakdown was useful, please like, share, and subscribe to Military Force for more battlefield analysis like this.